So we talked a little bit about how some of the founding fathers felt, a couple of them anyway. And like I said, you can look at the link and you can see who else had a problem with slavery and wanted it to end. But like I was telling you, that Britain didn't want them to end slavery. They wanted to continue the slave trade because it's profitable. All right. Now, I want to talk about briefly, and I say briefly, what happened post revolution. So now we have the Revolutionary War, and you have Britain losing control, and now America has her independence. Now, what happened? Now, in this, we're just talking about just dealing with slavery. You know, what's dealing with the blacks. All right, what's going on with them? Now, during this time, as remember, there are representatives of the colonies who are against slavery, and there are a heap of slaves in the South. I mean, you saw the map what Georgia looked like back then, and even then there was a lot of slaves. I think it was like 30,000 slaves around that time, I think, and um, and you had plenty of slaves in Virginia, plenty of slaves in South Carolina and North Carolina. I mean, they had a lot of them. So I mean, if we're talking about how America would function as far as voting and everything else, you know, you have a popular vote that would be involved, you know, and that would determine the amount of representation that would be involved in Congress. And so, because there were so many slaves in these states, the South would have more power, more representation in the Congress. That makes sense. And so, what they did, and I've heard this all the time concerning the Three-Fifths Compromise. I'm finna go here. I've heard this all the time concerning the Three-Fifths Compromise, that they viewed black people as less than human because of this that was put in place, this compromise, this clause. Because it was put in place, this showed how they view blacks as being less than human. But may I offer to you something different? Something different. All right. That maybe, just maybe, that the Three-Fifths Compromise was actually something that was put in place that would end up helping blacks in the end. Now I know some of you's like, wait a minute, Jamal, I ain't going there. I'm not going there with you. Okay, I feel you. I feel you. But let's look at something. Let's look at something. And I want to see if I can pull it up here. See, scrolling through. Yep, that's here. Yep. All right, so we're gonna read this. Let me pull this down, get this out the guys who's watching. All right, let me see if I can pull this up for you guys. All right. Now I hope you guys follow along with this. And I'm gonna read this out because this right here was helpful. All right, let's see. Okay, here we go. All right, we're gonna start from this paragraph right here. Hope you guys can see that. I'm not even checking the stream, so I'm hoping everybody's able to see everything. All right. And towards the end of this section, I will take a time to watch the comments and see if anybody asks any questions or anything like that. So you can feel free to ask. It's all good. But yeah, let's. Oh man, I've been waiting to get to here. All right. So I hope you can see that well. Let me look at the stream real quick just see if you can. I think you should be able to. I moved myself out the way so I won't be blocking nothing. All right. It says, while much progress was made by the founders to end the institution of slavery. Now, like, check this out. This sentence right here. While much progress was made by the founders to end the institution of slavery, unfortunately, what they began was not fully realized or achieved until generations later. So the founders actually wanted to end slavery. Now, real quick, before I go any further, I'm not trying to change subjects here, but this kind of entails what I'm trying to say about the founders. Richard Allen, which I know a lot of people give praise because he was the founder of the first AME church in Pennsylvania, first black church in Pennsylvania. And so he get a lot of praise, but it's interesting that he was friends with the founders. He was friends with men. He was the one. He was one who converted his master to Christianity. And I thought it was interesting because people always say how, oh, Christianity is a white man's religion because they wouldn't even know Christianity if it wasn't for the white man driving it into them and trying to force them. But actually, it's the opposite is true. Like you saw there were times where blacks converted their masters. And matter of fact, a lot of masters prevented their slaves from hearing the true gospel, prevented their slaves from reading the Bible because they know the truth it contains. And so it's interesting how people say that white people were trying to force feed Christianity into blacks when really they was trying to actually take it away from them. They was trying to take the Bible away from them. They didn't want them to know the truth of their salvation, to know Christ. That's interesting. Now, so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. Now, so while much progress was made by the founders to end the institution of slavery, unfortunately, what they began was not fully achieved until generations later. Yet, despite the strenuous efforts of many founders to recognize and practice that all men are created equal. Mm. So people tried to say that the founders, well, they put in the declaration that all men are created equal, but they didn't treat all men equal. So do you see the intention of their hearts was that they wanted to treat all men as equal? Their intention was always that they knew that these blacks were men, they were human beings, and they want to treat all men as equal. That's what their intentions was. And it said charges persist to the opposite. In fact, revisionists even claim that the Constitution demonstrates that the founders considered one who was black to be only 3/5 of a person. This charge is yet another falsehood. Yet another falsehood. The 3/5 clause was not a measurement of human worth. Rather, it was an anti-slavery provision. What? Huh. That ain't what all these woke folks is telling me. That ain't what these woke folks are saying. These woke folks are saying that no, we always been held down by whiteness. You know what I'm saying? But no, they're saying that this was put in place as an anti-slavery provision to limit the political power of slavery's proponents. That means so those who agree with slavery, those 4 colonies I told you, who had all these slaves, they had thousands. I think one colony had over 100,000 slaves. So they had all this representation. They had all this representation for their state, and so they wanted to limit that power. They wanted to limit them. And I'm gonna show y'all something, man. I hope it blesses you. I'm gonna show y'all something. He said, "What you gonna show me? I'm gonna show you." He says they wanted, so it was an anti-slavery provision to limit the political power of slavery's proponents by including only 3/5 of the total number of slaves in the congressional calculations. Southern states were actually being denied additional pro-slavery representation in Congress. That's what happened. That's what happened. They were being denied additional power, additional representation for their pro-slavery agenda in Congress. Y'all, this is going to show this is going to show and prove that, man, these founders, they couldn't fix something immediate, but they gave it a slow death blow. A slow death blow. So the question I asked earlier, if they were against it, then why couldn't they have ended it? Why not have said when we got our independence that we're going to stop? Well, because they didn't want America was not to be a dictatorship, and it wasn't going to be ran like Britain was. And so this is how they did it. They had to come together. They chose this way of going about government. So everything how voting on things happen, and so on and so forth. The checks and balances that go forth. How it started then, like all that had to be in place. So not one person is ruling everything. All right. So, and this is what they had to do. So, okay, well, y'all going to have slaves. You want to continue to have slaves. Okay. Well, for every 5 slaves you have, only 3 of them is going to count towards the vote or towards your population for representation in Congress. All right. Now, it's interesting fact is that prior to the revolution, blacks were able to vote and so on and so forth. Free blacks and so on and so forth were able to vote. So that's an interesting fact. But here, they're saying they're only for every 5 they have, only 3 of them are going to count for the representation. So it's not saying they were less than human or less than a person. It's just talking about their representation for Congress. So that's interesting. So it says, based on the clear records of the Constitutional Convention, 2 prominent professors explains the meaning of the 3/5 clause. While much progress was made by the founders to end, did I just read that? Okay, sound like I just read that again. Let me see that. We just read that. States and constitutional calculations, southern states were actually being denied. Yeah, read that. Here, it was slavery's opponent. Okay, it was slavery's opponents. That's what I want to read. It was slavery's opponents who succeeded in restricting the political power of the South by allowing them to count only 3/5 of their slave population and determining the number of congressional representatives. The 3/5 of a vote provision applied only to slaves, not to free blacks in either the North or the South. So there were free blacks in the North and in the South, not only the North. Like people always think that there were free blacks in the North, but no, there were free blacks in the South and free blacks in the South who owned slaves as well. Yeah, yeah, that's true. So that didn't apply to free blacks. Now that's important, y'all. That's important. That did not apply to free blacks, only to slaves. So check this out. How much time I got left here? I got 5 minutes left. Okay, cool. I want to show this to you guys. Check this out. Please check this out with me. And I'm hoping you following this. So in 1790, that was the first census. I hope you guys are seeing that. 1790 was the first census for the new America. All right, still 13 colonies, 13 states, if you will. So this is not a 50 states. This is only still 13 states. All right, at this time of their first census. So check this out. So we have at the time of the census, you got a number of free whites. Then you got all other free people would be the blacks and all that stuff like that. All other. Then you have the number of slaves, and then the total. Now, I want to show you this real quick. Maine and Massachusetts. Maine and Massachusetts. All that's there. No slaves. They own no slaves in Maine and Massachusetts. As you see, what I was mentioning earlier. Didn't mean to do that. Massachusetts and Maine. Maine and Massachusetts were the only 2 colonies that had no slaves. None. Everybody there are free. Everybody's there. All blacks there are free. No slaves. All right. Now you got here in Virginia 200,000. That's 292. 627. Almost 300,000 slaves. Wait a minute. I don't know why Ivan trying to call me doing a live stream. He about to get demoted. Let me turn my volume down. All right, so see if you see if you can message him and tell him to come out of that old stream and come to refresh the new one. Okay, you here now. All right. Okay, cool. It didn't pop up yet. All right, cool. So we Ivan here. So I'm gonna repeat that back. You might maybe you gotta hit that bell. I don't know if you hit that notification bell. You may have to do that, and that'll help you so you can get notified when it happens. Nathan said he was on a chocolate chip cookie high. That's probably why. All right. All right. So what I was saying earlier, I'm going to go back and repeat that over again. Man. All right. So here, this was the census of 1790. This was the first census of America, the new America. They got their freedom 1776. It will be A few years later, 1790, when they had their first census. All right. And so here we notice with Maine and Massachusetts, these are the only two colonies or states that would not have slaves at all. No slaves. And that's interesting. So I mentioned that was two colonies that didn't have slaves at all, and these were it: Maine and Massachusetts. These were the places of the North. All right. And matter of fact, I want to say it was Massachusetts, honestly, that I actually read about that they were so against it that when people tried to bring slaves there, they got the slaves and they bought them, set them free, and then took them back to Africa. And I want to, oh man, I want to say it was Massachusetts, but it's one of those northern states. That's what they did. They were so opposed to it that they actually bought them and they set them free and sent them back to Africa. Send them back to their homeland. And so that's what they did. And they were Christians. These were Christians who did that. So I thought that was some good information there. All right, so yeah, I want you to see that. And what I was pointing out, Virginia had almost 300,000 slaves. 300,000 slaves. Maryland had 100,000 slaves, a little over 100,000. North Carolina, 100,000. South Carolina, over 100,000. Georgia had almost 30,000 as of 1790. All right. So look at the representation that they would have had when it comes to population. I mean, they would have ranked higher, but because of the 3/5 clause, that cut back their representation. Now, what significance is that? Oh man, I think I saved it. I'm gonna pull it up. I'm gonna show you what significance that is. 1 second. I should have had this pulled up already. Y'all check this out, man. This right here was the bomb. Like when I pulled this up, man, I was like, what? Now I'm kind of overriding this a little bit. So I wanna minimize myself real quick so I can show you guys a little better. 'Cause, information is important. I'm not that important. The information is. All right. So I want you to look at those numbers. Just look at it. Look what it says at the top. Free African American population in the U.S. 1790 to 1860. Now keep in mind, slavery would completely be ended in America in 1865, 5 years later than what this stat shows. Just keep that in mind. But these are free African Americans. Remember, their popular vote would matter during this time. It would matter. It would count. All right. It wouldn't count when they were slaves. Well, not five. 3 out of 5 would count, but as a free man, all their votes counted, all of them. So let's look at this real quick. Here in 1790, the total of free blacks was 27,000 in the North, 32,000 in the South. In 1800, 10 years later, 46,000 in the North, 51,000. Was it 51? No, 61,000 in the South. I can't see. 61,000 in the South. In 1810, 10 years later, 77,000 in the North, 97,000 in the South. How is it in the South, where slaves are at the most, having more free slaves than in the North? Now, I thought that was amazing by itself, because I figured that the North would have more free slaves, or not free slaves, more free blacks than the South would. But the South always had more free blacks. Interesting. And it kept growing. Every 10 years, this number is growing. And what is happening? Every 10 years, the South is losing representation, year after year after year. Every 10 years, we're seeing the impact of it. In 1820, 99,000 in the North, 130,000 in the South. Here, 1830, 137,000 in the North, 175,000 in the South. Skip on to 1860. In the 1860, the number of free blacks in the North was 225,961, and the South was 250,787. The numbers kept growing for free blacks in America. And being the most, always the most in the South, which is considered the most racist. So this is interesting. The South was losing the representation. The plan that our founders put in place was working. It was working. I mean, they would love to have done it immediately, but because of how they was doing it, how they set everything in place for government, they dealt it a slow death blow. Did it take many years? Yes, it did. Yes, it did. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 plus years before their what they wanted will be realized. But it happened and they put it in place. They put it in place. I mean, do they get some kind of credit here? I mean, do they get an A for effort or something? I mean, wow. I mean, come on now. That's interesting, y'all. So there were blacks who held offices. They planted churches all through the 18th century, and that's in the 1700s. And so, and so we got Wentworth Cheswell. This was a black man. He held office. He had a prominent office, not just any kind of office. He held a prominent office. We're gonna look at him. We're gonna look at him a little bit. Uh, Lil George. Oh no, George Lau. Lil Lau George. Yeah, George Lau, and then the Reverend Andrew Bryan. These men, these black men, they some of them held offices. They were free blacks who were Christian and planted churches. Important people, and so and ex-slaves, ex-slaves. So I mean, it was very interesting, man, very interesting. And real quick, I want to just say I mentioned earlier how there were blacks who owned slaves after the revolution, and I was thinking, well, yeah, of course, blacks owned slaves before the revolution, but even after the revolution, blacks owned slaves. This was true. They own slaves, and some of them own slaves. They purchased their family members in order not to be split up, in order to be kept together, right? Which is a good thing. So therefore, if that's a good thing, then purchasing a slave can't be sin. Mm. Mm. They purchased their family members. They bought slave. They bought a slave, and they bought their family. So they would for the purpose of not being shipped away. But once again, if we argue on the side of consistency, if we say that it's a sin to purchase a slave, period, well then they actually sin against their family for purchasing them. Even though they just wanted them to stay with them, they sinned for purchasing their family. But we wouldn't say that. We wouldn't say the black man was sitting for purchasing his wife and his sister or his children. Nobody would say that. But unless you're going to suffer at the sin of partiality, you're going to have to say that. Unless you can reason and say, you know what? It may not have been actually a sin to purchase slaves. It may not have been. May not have been, maybe something that we got away from, and it's a good thing that we got away from it, but it wasn't necessarily a sin. I think that would be the more reasonable, conclusion if we're being fair with the information. And now there were blacks who purchased slaves and treated them unfairly, beat them after the revolution, not before. We're talking about free blacks who owned slaves and tortured, beat them. So it was a black slave woman. I mean, not black slave woman, a black woman who owned slaves, and a lot of them. And she was harsh towards her slaves. Harsh. The website I put in the description, theroot.com, they give this information. They give the names and the dates and stuff like that. I would encourage you to check this out. Check it out. Check it out, y'all. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to show it on the screen, but I'm going to read a couple parts from it for you guys. I'll do that because, man, this was this was interesting information. This goes completely against the narrative that we've been sold, and so I'm really convinced that concerning history, Black history in America, in this sense, we've been sold a bill of goods. We've been sold 30. We saw how many free blacks there were in 1830, a heap of them, and he owned 13 slaves. He and his 12 family members collectively owned 215 slaves. So not only him, together they owned 215 slaves. Interesting, right? A black man. His picture is the first picture you see when you pull up that website link. All right, they give some names of some other ones. Let's see if we go down some more. Um, let's see. They get one section on here says how many slaves did blacks own. It says so. It says so. What do the actual numbers of black slave owners and their slaves tell us? In 1830, the year most carefully studied by Carter G. Woodson, about 13.7% of the black population was free. Of these, 3,776 free Negroes owned 12,907 slaves out of the total of 2 million slaves owned in the entire United States. It's a lot. It says, so the numbers of slaves owned by black people overall was quite small by comparison with the number owned by white people. Fair enough. It's true, right? It says in his essay, The Known World of Free Black Slaveholders, Thomas J. Presley, using Woodson statistics, calculated that 54 or about 1% of these black slave owners in 1830 owned between 20 and 84 slaves. 172 owned between 10 to 19 slaves, and 3,550 each owned between 1 and 9 slaves. Crucially, 42% owned just one slave. Presley also shows that the percentage of free black slave owners as the total number of free black heads of families was quite high in several states, namely 43% in South Carolina, 40% in Louisiana, 26% in Mississippi, 25% in Alabama, and 20% in Georgia. So, it was interesting. Now, I want to read this to you. Moreover, Woodson explains benevolent Negroes often purchase slaves to make their lots easier by granting them their freedom for a nominal sum, or by permitting them to work it out on liberal terms. In other words, these black slave owners, the clear majority, cleverly used the system of slavery to protect their loved ones. That's the good news. But not all did. And that is the bad news. A person named Halliburton concludes, after examining the evidence, that it would be a serious mistake to automatically assume that free blacks owned their spouse or children only for benevolent purposes. Woodson himself notes that a small number of slaves, however, does not always he said a small number of slaves, however, does not always signify benevolence on the part of the owner. So that means that all because they may have owned only a few slaves doesn't mean that they were nice. And John Hope Franklin notes that in North Carolina, without doubt, there were those who possessed slaves for the purpose of advancing their own well-being. These Negro slave owners were more interested in making their farms or carpenter shops pay than they were in treating their slaves humanely. For these black slaveholders, he concludes, there was some effort to conform to the pattern established by the dominant slaveholding group within the state in the effort to elevate themselves to a position of respect and privilege. In other words, most black slave owners probably owned family members to protect them, but far too many turned to slavery to exploit the labor of other black people for profit. And he gives some names. He says John Stanley, born a slave in Craven County, North Carolina, the son of an Igbo mother, and her master, John Wright Stanley, became an extraordinary successful barber and speculator in real estate in New Bern. As Lauren, I can't pronounce her last name, so I'm not going to try. As Lauren points out in Black Property Owners in the South, by the early 1820s, Stanley owned 3 plantations and 163 slaves, and even hired 3 white overseers to manage his property. This is a black man who owned slaves and hired white people in 1820s. I'm sorry, y'all. It doesn't sound like to me that everybody's being marginalized here. It's not, it is time. I mean, of course, there were, we got some. Well, I'm just saying there were people who were coming up here. So he fathered 6 children with a slave woman named Kitty, and he eventually freed them. Stanley lost his estate when a loan for $14,000 He had co-signed with a white half brother, John, came due after his brother's stroke. The loan was Stanley's sole responsibility, and he was unable to pay it. Let's see. Now there was one I read. See what somebody was talking about. One of them who was harsh, but I don't see that now. I don't see that now. So anyway, let me take some. I'm gonna switch gears here, but y'all can check that website out. Check that website out, man. It's very helpful. It got some good information on there. Please check it out. I'm just seeing how this narrative is just tearing down. It's tearing down, man. So truth matters. Truth matters. All right. So I'm not seeing any. Okay. I'm not seeing any comments like that. No questions. All right. Cool. Cool. Cool, man. Let's see. Click on this live. All right. All right, man. I mean, this was a lot. This was a lot, and I'm hoping, my prayer is that people would listen to this, remove their preconceived notions and their emotions, move it out of the way. Don't let your emotions get in the way of all this, y'all. Like, don't let it get in the way of the truth, because that's what we're seeing too much of. Is that people don't want to see or hear the truth. They rather continue the narrative of hate and division and all this. People having to divest from whiteness, but then on the same term, you would have to divest from blackness. And people don't want to say that, because that's just, that's not politically correct. That's hate speech. Like, but it's not hate speech to say people got to divest from whiteness. Come on, man. Like, I'm hoping this information helps us. So, why is this destroying this? I don't know, man. I don't know. I would say, why is this not destroying this woke theology? I don't know, man. I don't know. People just hide on the rock, don't want to see the information, but it's mind blowing, man. Like, the information is right there. It's right there for you. You know, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But anywho, so what do we do? What do we do? Like, in the midst of all these flaws, we look at all of this in the world that's going on in the past and history and what's going on now. And what do we do? How do we go forward in the midst of all this? The answer is what it's always been, and that is the gospel. Look at everything. Look at everything. I did want to look at those people, man, but I had to take a break. We didn't have time. Man, but just check out those sources. I wanted to show you about this. I wanted to show you guys about this black man who was a slave and planted a church in the South. And not only planted a church in the South, but received help from white people. Received help from white people, and white people listened to him. They listened to his sermons. They listened to him preach. I mean, I wanted to share that with you guys. I wanted to show you them guys with that, man. Like, what was this author? No, Reverend Andrew Bryan. Reverend Andrew Bryan, man. Like, he started a church, received help from white people to start his church. Man, that doesn't sound like everybody was racist to me, man. That doesn't sound like it's everybody just, oh, I hate black people, A, B, and C. They're all just a bunch of, coons, this and that and the third. Like, not here. Not everybody. Just like the blacks, where there were some blacks who treated other blacks badly. There are white people who treated blacks badly. But why? Why were blacks treated unfairly? Why were they treated bad? Was it because of whiteness? Or was it because what God has always said? Sin. Sin in our hearts. All of us darkened by sin, bound to sin. And we can do nothing but sin. And that's why we need our hearts to be changed. But how is that to be? Through the gospel. Through the gospel. It's realized through Christ. He's our hope. He's the one who can fix it all. He's the one who's already fixed it at the cross. Do we not trust the finished work on the cross? that he has indeed began to make all things new. Because we don't see it right now, do we yet lose hope? And what I'm seeing is that people are mostly drawing from the past to bring up a present evil, which is non-existent. This false idea of a white supremacist nation today, yet to be proven, yet to be shown. You see blacks who are in the top 1% of the country. How is that if it's based off a white supremacist nation? Opportunity is there. Everybody never had the same opportunity, but that doesn't mean it's based off racism. And I said this before in another stream dealing with Eric Mason's book. Everybody may not get the same loan, have the opportunity to get the same loan, and everybody may not make the same wage, but that's okay. But that's not evil. That's not wicked. That's not belittling people. I think what we do is we get our focus off of Christ. And the sad thing is that the people who are proponents for the woke ideology are saying that they are the ones who's focusing most on Christ. But when they start talking about what's going on, you don't hear them mention sin. You don't hear them mention Christ and his judgment. None of that. What you hear is white man did this, white people did that, whiteness, whiteness, whiteness. They don't call it what it is, which is sin. And the reason why is because if they was to call it sin, know that this doesn't just go for white people. That if they call it sin, then that would go for black people. That would go for Latinos. That would go for everybody. So that's the reality of it, y'all. That's the reality. And then we need to continue to challenge that with the truth. The gospel is key. What is wrong with the world? Sin. How is what's wrong with the world going to be made right? Through Christ. Through Christ. The proclamation of the gospel message. And by God's grace, that he will save those who are his and bring them to himself by his grace, having mercy on all of us. What do? God is sovereign. He's sovereign, y'all. None of this happened by happenstance. I mean, God allowed the blacks to be free, plant churches, to convert other whites and Europeans to have a heart to leave slavery alone, who were for slavery at one point. Now their hearts have changed and they are against it. Like, God was sovereign in all of that, in all of it. He wasn't taken by surprise in any of it. And the people who are trying to perpetuate this division is seemingly forgetting that.